Antarctica is a strange, otherworldly environment, and the demands placed on both the people who work there as well as the equipment they must bring with them can be exceptionally high. Since the early 20th century, primitive motor sledges, automobiles, planes and tractors were all tested in various ways for helping assist overland expeditions of the continent, all to little real success. Perhaps most famously during the pre-World War II era of exploration was the grand Antarctic Snow Cruiser made by the Americans for the United States Service Expedition of 1939. This vast, wildly ambitious project was touted as the answer to all Antarctic exploration, a futuristic mothership that could, in theory, explore thousands of miles of Antarctic ice as it raced across the continent, planting the American flag and mapping uncharted areas of icy wasteland. Perhaps most revolutionary about this design was that everything, from the engine maintenance to crew accommodation, was all contained within one body, allowing the crews to live, work, and even repair the cruiser without ever having to face the sub-zero temperatures outside. This design was bold and ridiculously ambitious for the time, but upon arriving in Antarctica in 1939, the huge cruiser was plagued with numerous failures, not least of which being the massive treadless balloon tires and an underpowered drivetrain which made it hopeless in the deep soft snows and sleek Antarctic ice. Unfortunately, before any improvements could be made to the cruiser, it, along with the entire expedition, was prematurely abandoned due to the outbreak of World War II. The American Antarctic Snow Cruiser disappeared into the snow, and aside from a few reappearances in the 1950s, has been lost ever since. You would be forgiven to think that after such a resounding failure, the idea of a huge, self-contained exploration vehicle like the Snow Cruiser would be forever tarnished in the eyes of future expeditions. But this would not be the case. In fact, it would be the Soviet Union that would revisit and revolutionize this idea in the 1950s, creating a series of exploration vehicles so robust, so well designed, and so versatile that over 50 years later, these remarkable vehicles are still operating in the cold wastelands of Antarctica, exploring and providing an essential lifeline to those working in some of the harshest environments anywhere on Earth. They are the perfect example of the unique demands of Antarctica, but also of the amazing capabilities of Soviet engineering and design. These vehicles are called the Kharkovchankas, and to understand where they came from and what makes them so long-lasting, we must start at the beginning of Soviet explorations of the Antarctic.
Был создан подвижный оазис для жизни и работы в ледяной пустыне.
Following World War II, and as the Cold War ever escalated, numerous countries raced to re-establish a presence in Antarctica, both for research but also to help bolster claims to the land itself. Up until the 1950s, the Soviets had remained relatively uninterested in Antarctica, which is somewhat ironic considering it was more than likely that members of the first Russian Antarctic expedition of 1819 were probably one of, if not the first humans to ever actually spot the frozen shores of the fabled seventh continent. But while the Soviets may have come around to the idea of Antarctic expeditions a bit later than some other nations, they jumped into action with a bold and extensive plan to establish bases, exploratory missions, observation stations and marine expeditions to coincide with the first International Geophysical Year of 1957. The Geophysical Year was a multinational effort that had been established by over a dozen countries with interests in Antarctica to help collaborate and work with each other over scientific observations and research on the continent. For the Soviet Union, keen not to be left out of any potential land grab, and also eager to participate and demonstrate their prowess in the field of science, it was the perfect opportunity. The first Soviet Antarctic expedition set out on November 30th, 1955. Arriving on the Antarctic coast in early 1956, they eventually established the first Soviet Antarctic station and observatory named Mirny along the Pravda coast. Like most countries, the Soviets didn't have specialized equipment for Antarctica, and most of the vehicles they brought with them were essentially stock versions of military trucks and industrial civilian tractors that had been hastily adapted for Antarctic service. While the tracked machinery performed well, they were slow, uninsulated, and generally poorly suited to the extreme environments, especially inland, where the altitudes were higher and the temperatures were even lower. What the Soviets needed to complete their ambitious plans for further explorations and establishing bases deeper into the interior of Antarctica was something faster, more powerful, and capable of longer range travel. In November 1956, the second Soviet Antarctic expedition began, with a punishing schedule of expeditions and surveying that had been set out as part of the Soviets' program for the International Geophysical Year, with plans to establish 2 inland bases in uncharted areas of the eastern ice shelf, one being on the geomagnetic South Pole itself, a full 1,410 kilometres inland from Mirny and almost 3,500 metres above sea level. This time, however, the Soviets had returned with vehicles that would prove much better suited to the conditions they had experienced in their first trip, the huge ATT tractor. A Russian abbreviation for heavy artillery tractor, these vehicles were the precursor to what would eventually become the Kharkovchanka. The ATT is a heavy vehicle platform that was designed and built in the Kharkov machine building plant in Ukraine, a famous tank and machine factory that would be responsible for the majority of Antarctic vehicles of the Soviet era. While the ATTs have a bonnet and cab lifted from a more conventional ZIS truck, it actually shares a closer heritage to what was the Kharkov plant's most famous product, the T-54 or T-55 tank, one of the most widely produced tanks in history and still used in some countries to this day. The ATT was simply a tank hull with the engine swapped to the front rather than the back and a cab placed on top. Like the T-45 tank, it was well regarded for its reliability and simple design, and the impressive pulling power meant that it served a multitude of roles in the Soviet military. Upon arrival, the ATTs, also known as Product 401S, were immediately put to work in establishing 2 inland bases required for that year, setting out in overland expeditions from Mirny, pulling huge heavy sleds full of equipment, supplies and prefabricated huts. Even with these new, larger tractors, however, the season's programme proved to be exceptionally difficult and complicated work. Alongside strong hurricane-force winds and blinding snowstorms that could cover a land train within minutes, temperatures varied wildly, often dropping as low as minus 69 degrees centigrade, freezing components and fuel. In such conditions, diesel fuel froze to the point in which it could be cut by a handsaw, and fires would often have to be lit underneath the engines so they could be thawed to the point in which they might start. As they worked further inland, they also climbed ever higher, eventually passing 3,000 metres above sea level, where the thin air made many of the engines begin to fail due to oxygen starvation. To make matters worse, the ATT tractors were often getting stuck, whirring in place, and the heavy sleds that they pulled behind them would frequently be unable to run in the soft, powdery snow. The ATTs showed promise, however, and for the third expedition, they received upgrades to better help them overcome some of the challenges of Antarctic service. Wider 75cm tracks for better performance in the snow, as well as turbochargers fitted to the engines for operating at higher altitudes. It was becoming clear, though, that adapting or adding incremental updates to already existing vehicles wouldn't be enough. The Soviets required something that had been designed specifically for the extreme climates and demands of Antarctica. This was especially pertinent as the biggest and most ambitious project to date had been planned for the 4th expedition, a full traversal from Mirny Station all the way to the geographic South Pole, a full journey of over 5,000 kilometres through some of the toughest, coldest and remotest landscapes on Earth. Therefore, in 1957, the leadership of the Institute of the Arctic turned to the Soviet government with a request to create a new vehicle from scratch capable of operating in Antarctic conditions, based on their experiences and what they had learned with the tractors and overland trains so far. The expeditions needed a vehicle that retained the pulling power and the capabilities of the larger, upgraded ATT tractors, but with properly insulated accommodation for crews designed specifically for Antarctica, and that could allow them to better operate in the field independently and far from assistance or help. Such a task could not be completed using conventional vehicle designs, and as such, the unusual demands would require the joint expertise of 2 separate industries. The Soviet government had to find a capable heavy machine and tractor plant that could design and produce the vehicle platform and engines, and also expert aviation plants in the same area that could assist in the design and fabrication of low-weight components for the body and living accommodation. It would also require high levels of insulation aimed at protecting crews from temperatures as low as minus 75 degrees centigrade. Once again, the Ukrainian city of Kharkov provided the answer, where the Kharkov Transport Engineering cooking plant and the Kharkiv aviation factories were both located. The designers and workers of both factories had a massive task on their hands. Design and produce this unique, never-before-seen Antarctic exploration vehicle from scratch and in only 3 months. In the words of historian Dmitry Gladky writing about the development of these new Antarctic cruisers, the novelty and uniqueness of the tasks assigned to the enterprises required unusual approaches of which no one had experience. The body had to be a bus type with reliable insulation. It was necessary to equip a working compartment, a galley, a control compartment, a bedroom for 6 people, and also an equipment room, drying compartment and a vestibule. That is, a comfortable work and home complex all contained within one room. The deadline was defined, like anything in those days, very tight, only 3 months. It was necessary to have time to complete the drawings, translate them into metal, and at the same time instantly make adjustments in the process. The people involved in this project worked almost continuously, night and day, to complete. The various teams of designers, engineers and factories got to work. The ATT platform that had performed so well in previous expeditions was taken as the basis, and its chassis was lengthened by 2 rollers, bringing it to almost 9 metres in length. The tracks were widened once more, up from 75 centimetres to now an entire metre in width, to help reduce pressure on the snow. An upgraded 5-speed gearbox was also required to help power this heavier extended platform, along with a 12-cylinder 520 horsepower diesel engine that could achieve up to 900 horsepower by way of twin-turbine superchargers, allowing it better performance in the higher altitudes found inland. With the basic chassis established, it was here that the Soviet snow cruiser, or Project 404C as it was later known, started to take on its unique but somewhat familiar look. Doing away with a separate cab like on the ATT, the designers at Kharkov's aviation plant created a combined cab-over saloon design that housed the driver's cab, crew compartment and engine bay in a single self-contained duralium shell, insulated with 8 layers of nylon wool to provide insulation from the freezing Antarctic outdoors. The result was a remarkable aviation-inspired design that combined both the lessons that had been learnt by the Soviets in Antarctica so far, but also brought in many of the clear design elements of the original American snow cruiser that had been experimented with in the 1930s. Taking cues from the American cruiser's successful crew considerations, the Soviets could see the clear advantage of a design that allowed the crew to stay and work entirely within the confines of the machine itself, and much like the failed American cruiser, decided to locate the engine bay within the accommodation shell. This would allow access and maintenance to be able to take place without having to leave the cruiser, and also harnessing the engine heat to provide better heating to the accommodation itself. The end result was an incredible sight, an 8.5 metre long behemoth, 3.5 metres wide and over 4 metres high. Up front was a 4-seater cockpit containing the driver's controls, engine access, as well as a glass dome that could be used to take meteorological readings and positioning. With no radar and little radio contact in the field, navigators would often have to rely on a sextant and chronometer to lay the route along celestial bodies. The front windscreen was double glazed and lined with a heating element so that snow and ice could be melted away during operation, a feature unheard of in most vehicles of the time. From this driver's cockpit, crews could then access the rear accommodation, which was separated internally from the front cab by layers of insulation. At 30 square metres in volume, it was larger than many Soviet apartments of the time, and it was split into several rooms. A main working compartment contained a mess table, chairs, as well as bunks for up to 6, with the entire vehicle capable of sleeping 8. Off to one side was a radio room, and next to it an electric galley with hot plates and water boilers. To the rear of the cabin was an airplane-style toilet, as well as equipment rooms, drying compartments, and a secondary exit at the back. Kharkov's aviation plants had fitted high-spec, lightweight components such as the cooking equipment for galleys, water boilers, and 9 circular portholes in the accommodation section, all parts that were commonly found on planes of the era such as the Tupolev Tu-104. Alongside a pair of heaters powered by the onboard generators, the synthetic nylon wool layered into the walls of the accommodation was aimed at reducing heat loss, and each panel, gap and joint was sealed with heavy-duty tapes to prevent any further heat loss. Should the engines fail and the crews remain stranded, the crew accommodation was designed to lose heat at a rate of only 1 to 2 centigrades per day. The Project 404C, now nicknamed the Kharkovchankas, or literally Kharkov Women, could achieve speeds up to 35 miles an hour, climb slopes of up to 30 degrees, and even operate in water up to the depth of the cabin floor. It could tow up to 60 tons, that being on top of the 35-ton weight of the vehicle itself, and it was fitted with a 20-ton winch and a 100-metre cable. Along with the main fuel tank, it contained 8 auxiliary tanks under the crew compartment, giving it a total fuel capacity of 2,500 litres and an estimated range of around 1,500 kilometres. Working night and day, the designers and engineers managed to achieve the impossible. After 3 months of work, 3 fully loaded Kharkovchankas rolled off the production line ready for Antarctica. Each had been meticulously worked over, with engineers and workers at the plant being told to lick clean every component and mechanism to ensure that nothing could let down the machines in their grand journey to the South Pole. Sporting bright red colouring to make them even easier to spot against the white snow and ice, they left the Kharkov plant first on trucks and then by train to the port of Kaliningrad. Upon arrival, they were loaded onto the expedition icebreaker Obe and sailed out of the Baltic Sea, ready to start their long career in Antarctica. It had been a long journey from the basic tractors taken from civilian service for the first expedition, but there was also another giant red spectre that hung above the whole project. The construction design and ideas behind the Kharkovchanka seemed remarkably reminiscent to the failed US cruiser built only a few decades before and launched to similar fanfare. And both the irony and concern was probably not lost on the designers, who no doubt worried that their own snow cruiser, similarly built to such precarious timescales and with such high expectations, would suffer the same fate as their American counterpart. Thankfully, the Kharkovchanka would succeed in almost every way the US cruiser did not. But that's not to say they didn't have their problems, as the Soviet crews would soon find out in their grand expedition to the pole. Upon arriving in Mirny in early 1959, the Kharkovchankas were offloaded and immediately put to work. The Soviets had in mind for the 4th expedition an incredibly ambitious trial for the new tractors, a full traversal from Mirny station on the Pravda coast all the way to the geographic South Pole to where the new US Amundsen Scott base was located and back again. A full journey of over 5,500 kilometres, spanning some of the coldest, least understood areas of land on Earth and operating at altitudes over 3,500 metres above sea level. It would be a huge challenge for both the Soviet crews and their machinery, but on February 10, 1959, 3 new Kharkovchankas pulling trailers behind them set out for Mirny. First for the newly established Vostok station, which sat at the geomagnetic South Pole and would act as an intermediate point for the expedition. The train eventually left for the geographic South Pole from Vostok station in December 8, 1959, with the lead tractor of the South Pole train pulling out of Vostok along Meridian 106 East. It was made up of 16 men and 3 tractors in total, only 2 Kharkovchankas, along with 1 modified ATT tractor that had a built-in galley compartment on the rear. Between them they towed 4 sledge trailers, all piled high with the supplies and tons of fuel required for the trip. A.G. Dralkin was the leader of the party and wrote about the huge task ahead of them and facing it in vehicles that had only a few months ago been sitting on a production line in the Ukraine. The way ahead lay through completely unexplored regions of central Antarctica that had never been flown over by plane. What waited ahead, no one knew. We were heading out into the unknown, further and further from base, from Mirny and from Komsomolskaya and from Vostok. It was a tough and dangerous trip, and several of the shortcomings of the untested Kharkovchankas were starting to become apparent. The weight and size of the huge tractors meant that fuel consumption was incredibly heavy, but the expanded metre-wide tracks were causing much larger problems. In his book, Antarctica, A.G. Dralkin writes of the issues that started to appear with the huge snow cruisers. By 870 kilometres into the trip, 160 track pins were broken. Fuel consumption ranged from 9.6 to 12 litres per 1 kilometre. The average speed was a range of 4.6 to 6 kilometres per hour. The main engines worked well, but there was poor oil cooling. The temperature was kept at 95 to 100 degrees over the norm of 85. When parked with the heaters turned off, the temperature in the living compartment decreased from 30 to 35 degrees to minus 12 degrees centigrade by morning. The problem with the tracks became so serious that the new metre-wide tracks had to be shortened back down to 75 centimetres, and regular checking and maintenance of the pins was required to ensure they didn't come loose again during the journey. The huge weight of the vehicle, as well as the extra strain put on the gearbox and engine from the wider tracks, also led to a gearbox failure in one of the Kharkovchankas. Amazingly, the Soviets had the foresight to bring a spare, and rather than fix it in situ, the entire gearbox was lifted from the top of the machine and swapped out. It was not an easy job, however. Weighing over 600 kilograms, the teams were forced to work in minus 55 degree temperatures for 5 days to get it running again. Despite these teething troubles with the new machines and the challenges of the land itself, on the 26th of December 1959, the teams at the US Amundsen Scott base were surprised to see a small smudge of black and red appearing on the bright white horizon. The small overland train, made up of practically untested vehicles that had only rolled off the production line a few months previously, had made it to the geographic South Pole. The Soviets were welcomed with open arms and given a full tour of the new US base at the geographic South Pole. Raising the flag along the American stars and stripes, it was an encouraging moment of cooperation amid the ongoing global Cold War. The Soviets even did the traditional round-the-world journey by circling a stack of empty barrels that marked the true geographic South Pole. On December 29th, after making a farewell turn at the pole, the train set out back again for Vostok Station, successfully reaching it 13 days later. The South Pole trip was an amazing achievement for the Soviet expedition, and despite the issues from the new vehicles, it demonstrated the strength and effectiveness of the huge snow cruisers, with both the vehicles and crews performing admirably over their 5,000-kilometre journey. The Kharkovchankas would take place in dozens of more exploratory missions deep into the uncharted regions of the Antarctic ice shelf, but also in what was undoubtedly becoming some of the most essential work of the Antarctic season, the vast hauling of supplies and fuels to the numerous Soviet bases located on the Antarctic ice shelf. In 1963, British glaciologist Charles Swithenbank had the rare opportunity to live and work with the Soviets in Antarctica, despite the Cold War being in full swing. He wrote in his book Vodka on Ice, "I was consumed with admiration for both the 35-ton Kharkovchanka and also the 25-ton ATTs. What other vehicles, I wondered, could ply the route from Vostok to Mirny twice per year under extreme weather with soft snow surfaces in tractor trains hauling hundreds of tons of cargo? Without a load, both types could cruise at speeds up to 30 kilometers per hour, though driving over certain types of snow gave a very bumpy roller coaster kind of ride." As the years went on, however, the cruisers became increasingly relegated to non-exploratory work in place of the smaller and more efficient ATT tractors. A Soviet report from 1963 noted that while the Kharkovchanka exploration vehicles are intended for carrying out inland expeditions with the aim of performing various geophysical studies and other operations, in most cases they are used as tractors, trucks, that is, not for their intended purpose. There were several issues with the Kharkovchankas, much of it coming from the unusual design. For the crews living inside for long periods of time, they found that locating the engine bay inside the body of the vehicle may have made it easier to access without leaving the cab, but it made it difficult to achieve full access to the engine and often created problems with keeping it cool. Worst of all, however, the acrid diesel smoke would back up into the accommodation cab, coating everything and everyone with the smell of diesel and soot from the engines. As they had also discovered on the South Pole trip, the insulation turned out to be far less effective than designed and meant that the heaters, generators and engines had to be run for longer, exacerbating many of the problems. As reports back to Moscow laid out, the Kharkovchankas, while useful, had not been fully effective in their role at replacing the general all-round ability of the ATT tractors. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet expedition began to look at the requirements of a successor to the original Kharkovchanka. The originals were bold designs with a focus on self-sustainability and exploration, with their all-internal design much like the American snow cruiser. However, the issues with fumes, the engine noise, as well as access to the engine bay and problems with the gearbox, as well as the shifting requirements of vehicles from exploration to the hauling of supplies to various stations, made the designers rethink several elements of the new generation. In December 1974, the Kharkov plants once again returned to the task of creating a purpose-built exploration vehicle that would end up being the second and final generation Kharkovchanka. With over 2 decades of experience in the Antarctic to now draw from, the designers had a clearer idea about what worked and what didn't. The biggest change of the Kharkovchanka-II was to return to a similar design style of the much more traditional ATT tractor. In their time at the pole, many ATT tractors had been upgraded with rear compartments, and it was decided to use this as a basis for the new design, combining both the advantages of the larger custom-built Kharkovchankas with that of the more conventional ATTs. Keeping the same extended chassis and upgraded drivetrain for better pulling power, issues with the tracks and gearbox were addressed, but most distinctively of all, the new Kharkovchanka would would be fitted with a more standard front-mounted engine with bonnet and cab layout, allowing much easier access to the engine bay compared to the original cab-over layout. This also allowed better cooling and a better separation from the driver's cockpit and the accommodation bay at the rear. It was here in the accommodation bay that many lessons had been learnt from the first generation. Fitting out at the Kharkov aviation plant, new, better quality insulation was fitted to the walls, as well as small touches learnt from experiences in the field, such as eliminating through bolts that passed through the walls and allowed bridging points from when the cold could seep into internal spaces. The layout of the internal living space was altered slightly as well, and perhaps the most valuable addition was that of auxiliary generators, meaning that the main vehicle engines could remain off while power and heat could still be delivered to the accommodation. This second generation felt like a more refined version of the Kharkovchanka, perhaps less ambitious than the original, but benefiting from the decades of experience that the Soviets had now picked up living and working in Antarctica. Once again, the teams at the Kharkov plants worked tirelessly, and by fall 1975, 3 new second-generation Kharkovchankas rolled off the production line, much like they had in 1958. The teams no doubt felt much more confident about these new bright red tractors, having heard and seen the success and longevity of their previous work, and now knowing that a worthy successor was being sent to Antarctica to assist with the work out there. This second generation of Kharkov Women would define themselves as even more reliable, comfortable, and perhaps most importantly, warmer than anything that had come before. Few vehicles could probably claim the longevity and resilience in tough conditions than that of the Kharkovchankas. As the years and technology progressed, methods for living and working in Antarctica changed and improved. The Kharkovchankas and the various ATT tractors would remain, however, useful and resilient as ever on overland train journeys to restock the various bases around Antarctica. In the 1980s, budgetary issues meant that a potential third generation Kharkovchanka based on the MTT tractor was put on permanent hold, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union and further budgetary issues, the Kharkovchankas remained the main transportation system well beyond what many probably initially expected of their lifespan. So with that in mind, where are they now? Well, up until only a few years ago, both generations of Kharkovchankas remained in operation as full frontline vehicles, working amongst the remote bases of what are now the Russian Antarctic operations. Especially important are the aforementioned supply runs to inland Vostok Station, as well as some research and exploratory runs. On the Russian forum The Polar Post, a user posted a series of photos showing 2 generations of Kharkovchanka at the Russian Progress Station. Visible in the photos is a second generation Kharkovchanka numbered Kharkov-III and an original numbered 22, having been seemingly repainted in green at some point and now sporting the Russian Federation flag. Kharkov-II has a rich history and is actually mentioned in the book 72 Degrees Below Zero, a biographical account of life and work in Antarctica by writer Vladimir Sanin. The whole world knows of our Kharkov-II. It's travelled tens of thousands of kilometres along Antarctica, visited the pole of inaccessibility, and decorated a postage stamp with its image. It isn't clear what's happened to the other original Kharkovchankas, but it's likely as the vehicles aged and parts became scarce, the others may have been cannibalised to keep the 22 running. Kharkov-II seems to have been the very last of the first generations to remain in regular service, having taken part in regular supply runs up until 2010, a full 50 years after it had first arrived on the continent. In 2015, Kharkov-II reappeared, however, now restored to original colours and parked at the Progress Station as a monument to this incredible series of vehicles. Much like the ATT monument in Vostok, historical sites around Antarctica must first be registered and approved by members of the Antarctic Treaty. In the Russian submission statement for the Kharkov-II, they stated, "Proposal on inclusion of over-snow heavy tractor Kharkovchanka that was first used in Antarctica from 1959 to 2010 to the list of historical sites and monuments. It is noted that the tractor was the first non-serial transport vehicle of the Soviet machine building produced exclusively for operations in Antarctica and was a unique historical sample of engineering technology developments made for the exploration of Antarctica." The Russian Federation highlighted the historical significance of the Kharkovchanka tractor and its commemorative and emotional value to all who visit it in Antarctica. As for the second generation Kharkovchanka, closing in on 45 years into their mission, it seems that they are still being used in some capacity on land trains and for general work. A similar forum post from 2015 showed 3 of them in storage at Vostok, ready to take part in the next land train operation. It seems that at least 2 are still fully operational, and more recent photos from Vostok, taken only a couple of years ago, show them similarly lined up in the outdoor equipment stores. The sub-zero temperatures and the lack of moisture means equipment can survive much better outside and for long periods of time in Antarctica, and they are seemingly fully prepared and ready to enter service when necessary. The accommodation bays are often still being used as extra sleeping quarters. It's indicated in this post from a worker at Vostok Station that the second generation Kharkovchankas may soon be reassigned to the Progress Station as well, and have largely been replaced on overland supply trains. It also seems that out of the 3 pictured, 2 are operational, while a third is used for parts and spares. The interiors still feature the gas stoves and fittings, all mainly in working order and ready to enter service. There's even instruction manuals still inside. In Russian forums and magazines, there is an admiration for these vehicles, and many popular science magazines and promotional stamps and toys have been produced around the Kharkovchankas in the past. Some do now lament, however, the fact that new, better technology and new equipment hasn't been afforded to many of the teams in Antarctica. That said, while these vehicles may be loud and rough around the edges, they are still incredibly capable and robust platforms, able to fulfill a multitude of roles, and therefore are still able to perform various useful functions in Antarctica despite their age, and while parts are still relatively available. Upon reaching out to the Russian Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute, they have stated that the Kharkovchankas have been generally replaced, first by the Vityaz DT-30s, and more lately by newer, more advanced German piston bully 300 polars. The Kharkovchankas are in many ways the perfect summation of both the unique history of technological development in Antarctica, but also of the amazing capabilities of Soviet engineering and design. Built during a time when the world was consumed in a military and nuclear arms race, these vehicles best represented the unusual spirit of peace and cooperation in Antarctica, where people of all nations were coming together to explore and study something that transcended international politics. The vehicles themselves, however, are descended from weapons of war, and only the incredible engineering of platforms such as the T-54 tank and the cutting-edge Soviet aviation technology of the time could make such vehicles possible. In the end, it was Vladimir Sanin who best summed up the Kharkovchanka in 72 degrees below zero. Hope and support, the insurance policy of the polar explorer. Kharkovchanka. Tractors will stall, fail, but Kharkovchanka remains. It will shelter everyone, save them, and bring it home. Only she is capable of such, the cruiser of the White Desert. Oh, thank you very much for watching my video on the Kharkovchanka, the Kharkovchanka. I've probably mispronounced it 100 million times over the course of the video. If you are Russian, if you are Ukrainian, if you speak those languages, if you have any respect for either the English language or just the pronunciation of words, I am very, very sorry because I have probably slaughtered the pronunciation of so much over the course of this video. I did try. Turns out I'm just not very good at pronouncing stuff, which is ironic considering my vocation and my hobbies. But anyway, really fun project. I had an absolute blast making this. Definitely one of the most rewarding kind of video projects I have made. It's a very difficult one to get into. The sources around this are quite niche. A lot of what I have are printouts from old magazines and things like that, blogs and forums and web pages that I had to use Google Translate to kind of parse and understand. But being able to kind of piece together the story of the Kharkovchankas has been great. That's the important thing though, is it's piecing together this stuff. There are loads of references, dozens of blogs and photos and various things that I've referenced over the course of this video. It might not all be fully correct. I will always say that about anything, and you should probably go and research this stuff yourself if you are interested. And if you do, again, speak these languages and you feel like I've missed out on anything, don't hesitate to get in touch, especially about the more kind of recent stuff. I am sure exactly what has happened to a lot of these things, and I would love to get the insight of somebody who works out in Antarctica. I had reached out to a few people, but I've only been working on this for about 3 weeks now, and some of them just haven't got back in contact with me. Some folks that did get back in contact contact with the Russian Arctic and Antarctic Research Institute. I think their name is designed so that I cannot pronounce it. Really nice guys. They gave me a whole bunch of information, a whole bunch of references and sources. So shout out to them. They are really, really good. Books. I mentioned this book, Vodka on Ice. Charles Swithenbank. Really great. He actually sadly passed away, I think, in 2014. Really great insight, though, into the sort of real gulf of differences between the Soviets and the sort of NATO nations, especially down in Antarctica back then. It is full of really high-quality photos and just a really great insight into everything that was happening down there during that really fascinating period of time. Another book that's really good is this. This is Soviet Geographical Explorations and Discoveries. Very descriptive title. It has everything. It goes up to 1976, so just before the second generation of Kharkovchankas. The maps that are in here are amazing. Some of them I've actually referenced in the video itself, and it is South Pole, North Pole, it is West Africa, it is South America, China, all that kind of stuff. Really, really fascinating. The Soviets' geographical sciences were really, really fascinating, and the discoveries that they made as well back then were really amazing too. Now, one final thing, I'm actually currently drawing the Kharkovchanka. If you don't know, I do art in my spare time, and I've been drawing this quite fun schematic of the Kharkovchanka, and you can actually buy that if you go to my Redbubble site. It allows you to upload artwork. You can then apply that or buy that on posters, t-shirts, clocks. You probably can't get on a clock, I don't know, but you can go and see yourself there. But it's great fun. I love drawing these things. It's a slightly more stylized, cartoony version of the Kharkovchanka, but I'd like to do one on the Antarctic Snow Cruiser as well. And I think finally, the Antarctic Snow Cruiser, I think, hangs over this project, and I think this video bookends my first video on the Antarctic Snow Cruiser quite nicely, because the two are inextricably linked. There is nothing like these things, these giant kind of independent exploration vehicles, and you can see the clear design elements that were brought over from the American Snow Cruiser to the first generation Kharkovchanka. And one thing that does make me laugh, not to be too mean to the American Snow Cruiser, but one of the things that really did not work on the Kharkovchanka was this unibody design. The diesel fumes were getting everywhere. It was hard to get engine access, overheating, all this stuff. Where did this unibody design come from? The American Snow Cruiser. It seems the curse of the American Snow Cruiser just follows you absolutely everywhere. So yeah, really good fun. One thing I would recommend if you're on YouTube right now, as I'm sure you are, there is... Okay, that's not the video. There's a... That's some guy singing to a goat. There is a video, an amazing movie called 76 Degrees Below Zero. It is the movie adaptation of the book by Vladimir Sanin that I referenced. It is so good. It's filmed out there. It's in Russian. That's the problem. I can't understand a word of what they're saying, and it's on YouTube at a really rubbish quality. If you have that film, if you somehow have a DVD or a tape, please send it to me. Please get in contact. I've watched it so many times and I absolutely love it. But yeah, thank you very much for watching, guys. Again, love making these videos. It's really fun that there is an audience of people who are also interested in these things as well. And I am going to keep you any longer. So thank you very much for watching, and yeah, see you next time. Bye-bye.